Welcome to Employee Termination Tips. My name is Christopher Neufeld of Neufeld Legal. And in this particular video, we're going to discuss why Alberta employees should really scrutinize their termination and severance pay packages when they're fired, terminated, or otherwise laid off from their job. And the reason for Alberta employees in particular to be doing this is because Alberta's structure is premised on their own employment standards legislation, the Alberta Employment Standards Code. And it is very specific to Alberta and has a very specific computational methodology that it follows. And for two primary reasons, it would appear, there is significant divergence coming about with respect to payroll practices that in turn leads to what we're seeing to be significant issues with respect to the termination and severance pay packages, or otherwise the exit packages, that fired and terminated Alberta employees do receive all too often, which are not consistent with the Alberta Employment Standards Code. And these two reasons are, number one, the payroll software that's being used, and number two, the payroll practices and training that's being employed by the payroll staff. So let's go and address payroll software. Almost all payroll software is created in the United States. It has its genesis in the United States. And the United States, to say the least, is a very employer-friendly system, which is heavily based on contract as opposed to statutory legislation as it is in Canada. And when they do roll it up into Canada from the United States, they typically start with Ontario, headquartering in Toronto. And if anything, out of all the provincial employment standards legislation, each province has their own. In a professional estimation, with respect to payroll and with respect to structuring, Ontario is the most comparable to the United States. So the changes, in many respects, on the operational side are minimal. And there's another aspect to it, is that typically, with respect to Ontario and having been born and raised and educated in Ontario and having practiced in Ontario, the one area which you would see a significant distinction between Ontario and the United States, that being allowances, is not so prevalent in Ontario as it is in Alberta. Now, what you find in Alberta is you have a lot of allowances that are being paid out, largely because you're dealing with a couple key industries where people either don't live there and travel into it, or even if they live close to site, they're being paid for living there as opposed to one of the metropolitans. And those industries are your mining industry, your petroleum, oil and gas industry, and the forestry industry. Those would be your key ones, with petroleum, oil and gas being the central one that sees considerable allowances being paid out. And because of that, and unlike Ontario, where allowances tend to be a lot more limited or not pursued as much, allowances do have an impact. But then you have other aspects within these payroll software systems that simply do not comport with the Alberta Employment Standards Code. And because they do not align, and because no one sufficiently scrutinizes this stuff, there is the very high likelihood, especially when you're working outside the city, but even when you work in Calgary or in Edmonton, that you could find yourself using computations, or at least the software uses computations, that are inconsistent with the Alberta Employment Standards Code. And that happens with some of the largest companies out there. That's a reality you have to deal with. Now, the second aspect is payroll staff training and payroll practices. Because so much of the training either emanates from Toronto and Ontario, where the Canadian Payroll Association is and they have programs and the like, or it's the fact that people are overly reliant upon the software, they look to the software, or the fact that they don't look towards accountants and lawyers to fully vet and understand what they're doing relative to the statute. What instead they do is they do the practices that they're trained on and are replicated over and over again. And this in turn results in practices that are actually not consistent with the specific wording of the Alberta Employment Standards Code. And once again, I have to say, there are very specific elements, very specific requirements that all too often seem to be not addressed. And when you're not dissecting it and scrutinizing it, you're not going to come across this stuff. And there's not enough of it being done. You can even see it oftentimes in the actual termination letters that are being put forth. If you have a sharp eye for it, and you actually understand what the differences are between the various provinces' employment standards legislation, you can actually at times, you'll see written in it, and sometimes it's even written up by lawyers. This is the crazy thing about it, that they will be providing stuff or doing stuff which is appropriate in another province or in another country, but does not work in the province of Alberta. And it's because it's not following the statutory laws to a T. And they do it over and over and over again. And from the perspective of the employer, if you would take a look at it, it's going to cost them more money to do it correctly. So from a cost analysis, you don't proceed to make changes. Those changes cost you too much. There's so many ways that these costs can build up. Losses can build up. And because of that, it is avoided like there's no tomorrow. It's simply the case. Avoidance seems to be the approach. Or maybe they haven't looked at it. And even the lawyers for the employers seemingly don't address these aspects or don't look fully into it. They address some of the aspects. And what happens is when they do address those aspects, there's another situation, I'll call it for lack of a better word, where the employers and their lawyers know that this is going to happen every once in a while when somebody challenges it. And when they do challenge it, they'll pay out something. Not a great amount, but they'll pay something. And then they'll use confidentiality agreements and settlement agreements and releases to shut the people up. And that's the circumstance you'll find yourself in. But because of those two situations, one being the software, two being the payroll practices, truthfully, Alberta is a mess when it comes to the situation as to what you're getting in your exit package. Because the amounts, at least in our professional estimation, all too often, from what we've seen, are inadequate. There's further amounts that are due. There's further money that's due. And we're not blowing up smoke. What we're doing is we're looking specifically at the Alberta Employment Standards Code and what's put on the paper and what's put on the contracts and what's put in the pay statements, the T4s, and all the other documentation that comes out. There really is a lot out there. And unfortunately, people have not pursued this as aggressively as they should, So there's earned money out there that people are just leaving on the table, not pursuing, not going after, and they really need to be doing something about that. Yes, we do that for our clients, but from the sounds of it, not enough people are pursuing it. Not enough people are recognizing where the issues are. They're too focused, maybe it seems like, on certain standardized practices. Even the lawyers are, as to how they pursue stuff, and they're not going beyond it. And if they would really seriously look at the Alberta Employment Standards Code, see what it says, and even compare it to what it says in other provinces and other countries as to how they are doing stuff, then you probably understand where the deficiencies are, where the mistakes are, and why it is that all too many employees, when they're fired, their termination severance pay packages are not what they should be. They're significantly less than what the code requires to be paid and what the common law would suggest. Because part of it is termination pay is sort of tied into severance pay. And if you're underpaying on termination pay, there's a corollary effect with severance pay, even though it's based on the common law. There's a lot more issues, a lot more stuff legally that you can tie into that can boost the severance pay and make it problematic for the employer. But that's what you need to be understanding, and that's why you need to specifically be looking, if you're fired in Alberta, to really scrutinize your exit package and determine if you got paid fully. If not, you really should seek legal counsel. Work with legal counsel. They can pretty much, if they know what they're doing, really identify and clarify to you in very short order, if you have the right paperwork in front of them, what you are legally entitled to based on the Alberta Employment Standards Code and based on case law with respect to severance pay. Thank you.